Good morning, this is your Kelso Report for Tuesday, March 5th, and I'm your host, Clark Kelso. The United States Supreme Court starts us off with an interpretation of the battery exception to sovereign immunity in the context of a medical malpractice claim. Next, the Ninth Circuit reviews an Arizona traffic safety statute under the First Amendment. And we have two decisions from the California Supreme Court, one involving the ex post facto clause, and the other one involving the suspension and revival of a corporation's powers for failure to pay taxes. Let's get started with the Federal Tort Claims Act and the battery exception. The United States is, of course, immune from suit except where it has given its consent. Generally, that consent is found in statutes enacted by Congress where the United States immunity is waived. One of the major waivers of sovereign immunity is found in the Federal Tort Claims Act, which waives the government's sovereign immunity from tort suits, but excepts from the waiver certain intentional torts, including battery. So ordinarily, you cannot sue the government for battery. In Levin v. United States, the court had to consider whether the Gonzales Act, which deals with injuries suffered by veterans, created an exception to the FTCA's exception for battery. In particular, the Gonzales Act declares that, quote, "For purposes of the Act, the intentional tort exception shall not apply to any cause of action arising out of a negligent or wrongful act or omission in the performance of medical functions." The Ninth Circuit read this language as reinforcing the exception for battery. On the theory that Congress might have been worried that some states would treat an ordinary medical malpractice action as though it was a battery. The plaintiff, by contrast, read the statute as creating an exception to the exception and establishing his right to bring a claim of medical battery against the United States. The plaintiff's case factually involved a true medical battery. The plaintiff alleges he orally had withdrawn his prior written consent to cataract surgery, yet the physician went ahead and performed the surgery. The Supreme Court rejected the government's interpretation and reversed the Ninth Circuit, emphasizing that the most natural reading of the statute was to establish an exception to the exclusion of battery from liability under the Federal Tort Claims Act. The decision resolves a split of authority in the circuit courts and makes clear that a true medical battery claim is actionable against the United States government. Next, we turn to the First Amendment and a decision by the Ninth Circuit. Arizona had enacted a statute that makes it unlawful for a motor vehicle occupant to hire or attempt to hire a person for work at another location from a stopped car that impedes traffic. The statute was challenged on First Amendment grounds in Val de Sol versus Whiting. Arizona defended the statute as a traffic safety measure, while the plaintiff argued it was an unconstitutional restriction on commercial speech of day laborers and those who would hire them. The Ninth Circuit agreed with the plaintiffs and struck down the statute, or actually affirmed the grant of a preliminary injunction. Although the court recognized the state has a substantial interest in traffic safety, it held that the state had failed to justify a need to serve that interest through targeting and penalizing day labor solicitation that blocks traffic, rather than directly targeting those who create traffic hazards without reference to their speech. In addition, the court was concerned that Arizona had singled out day labor solicitation for a harsher penalty while leaving other types of solicitation speech that blocks traffic unburdened, whatever speech that might be. Given this analysis, the Ninth Circuit affirmed a preliminary injunction against enforcement, which had been issued by the district court. Now, I think this is actually a pretty close case. The statute could easily be interpreted as a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction that simply targets the mechanics of closing a transaction instead of a burden on speech. We'll see if the case holds any interest for the Supreme Court. Now we turn to the Supreme Court of California, where we have two decisions. The first involving the ex post facto clause. In 2008, California voters had approved Proposition 9 of the Victims' Bill of Rights Act of 2008, also known as Marsy's Law. The changes enacted by Marsy's Law included amendments to Penal Code Section 3041.5 that increased the period of time between parole hearings, but allow for the advancement of a hearing if a change in circumstances or new information establishes that there is a reasonable probability the prisoner is suitable for parole. The petitioner in re Vix argued that application of these new parole procedures to prisoners who committed their crimes prior to the enactment of Marsy's Law violates the ex post facto clauses of the federal and state constitutions. California Supreme Court unanimously rejected these arguments. The ex post facto clause is designed to prevent government from retroactively altering the definition of crimes or increasing the punishment for criminal acts as a matter of fundamental fairness and fair notice. Whether retroactive application of a change in parole law violates the ex post facto clause is often a difficult question because of the broad discretion vested in a parole board. The court here upheld the changes in Marsy's Law based on its analysis and conclusion that the changes did not create a significant risk of prolonging a prisoner's incarceration, given the discretion given to the board to advance the time for a hearing in appropriate cases. Next, we turn to a civil procedure question. According to California tax law, if a corporation fails to pay its taxes, the Franchise Tax Board may suspend its corporate powers. The state may later revive those powers when the corporation pays its taxes. Well, the issue frequently arises whether acts taken by the corporation during the time its powers have been suspended are legally effective. In Boris v. Lord, the Supreme Court of California considered whether a corporation had filed a notice of appeal while its corporate powers were suspended may proceed with the appeal after those powers have been revived, even if the revival occurs after the time to appeal has expired. Well, consistent with prior case law, the court held that the revival of corporate powers validates an earlier notice of appeal. Essentially, that validation and revival is effective nunc pro tunc to the time that the corporate taxes should have been paid. And that's it for today's Kelso Report. Have a great day in the law.